So I will start with an overview of the challenge we face with the climate crisis in Massachusetts. Here in Massachusetts, we have had mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reductions since 2008 because of the Global Warming Solutions Act. These were updated earlier this year by the Climate Roadmap Bill, which we'll talk briefly about, to be 50% emissions reductions by 2030, still the same 80% emissions reductions by 2040, and net zero emissions by 2050. This is very exciting because before that it was just 80% by 2050, and we all know that that is just not going to do it when it comes to the climate crisis and completing a responsibility to reduce emissions to fight this global problem. Through our advocacy at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we work towards the development of smart and cost-effective programs and policies to meet these climate goals. Today, we'll talk briefly about the different sectors of emissions that we are trying to address and the work that we're doing to reduce the emissions in each of them. I like to start with this pie chart of where our emissions in Massachusetts come from, because I think it's a helpful orienting to know what types of policies are most important and how we can reduce emissions from all of the sectors. Transportation produces the most emissions. This slide, by the way, is from 2017 because we haven't had a greenhouse gas emissions inventory since 2017 in Massachusetts, but hopefully we'll be able to update that soon. And most likely the balance of where emissions coming from in Massachusetts has not changed that much since 2017. Transportation is the bulk of emissions. Buildings and heating, that is the natural gas system that powers our building heat systems, as well as oil heating, propane, biomass, things like that. That is 33%. And then electricity, that is the power plants that produce our electricity, is 19% of emissions from Massachusetts. However, electricity is super important because one of the main ways of reducing emissions in transportation and buildings is electrifying them, which means that in order to shrink the pieces of the pie that are transportation and buildings, we'll also have to grow the amount of electricity we're using. And we want to make sure that that is renewable electricity so that that sector of the pie continues to shrink as well. Massachusetts needs to have strong planning in order to meet these statutory climate goals. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan is the administration's plan for how it's going to comply with our laws around the climate goals. We do clean energy and climate plans every 5 years, I believe, to get us to our goals. The most recent one the draft was released in December of 2020. And the final draft is due July 2022. If any of you were in my breakout session last year at our fall meeting, you'll remember us talking about the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And it's kind of wild to me that we are still talking about it a year later and will be for another 6 more months. But this plan is very important. It covers all sectors and lays out the numerous strategies the administration plans to take to meet these goals. The development or finalization of this plan is being pushed even further out because the next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy, an act, was signed in March 2021 by the governor. And this act created some new requirements for the CECP. It upped the amount of emissions reductions required to 50% by 2030. It also upped the amount of offshore wind that is planned to be procured in the state, adopted new appliance efficiency standards, which we're really excited about. That's something that we worked really hard on for years. It set new environmental justice protocols. It created new requirements for the energy efficiency programs. It also created new funds for workforce development and equity in Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and many other things. We're not going to go all the way into what this bill did, but we do have that information on our blog, which I encourage you to check out. This piece of legislation is really important because it accelerates the timeline of the action that the administration needs to take to meet climate goals. However, it also makes it even more difficult. So that's why we're waiting to see what the administration comes up with in the next draft of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. The first draft had some good ideas. We'll talk about them later on in this presentation. However, it was not enough. Some of our comments on the first draft of the plan included that we really want to see more ambition on the electric sector in particular. And I will move on to the electricity sector on the next slide. So the electric sector, as I mentioned earlier, is crucial to reducing emissions across the board in Massachusetts. It's also one of the areas in which we are in some ways best prepared to reduce emissions, because Massachusetts has been growing its renewable energy programs for a long time, and we have an incredible amount of capacity in offshore wind in particular. Offshore wind is poised to be one of the biggest new industries in Massachusetts, and we've made some really exciting movement on offshore wind in the past year. We will need the cheap, affordable, and reliable electricity that is provided by offshore wind to meet our climate goals, and we believe that it will help accelerate the decarbonization of the electric sector. Over the last year, I believe back in May, Vineyard Wind received its final approval and permits to start construction, and Vineyard Wind started construction just a few weeks ago in November. So that is a really exciting step forward. Vineyard Wind will be the first large-scale offshore wind project in the country. There are two very small ones currently, one in Rhode Island and one in Virginia. But Vineyard Wind is going to bring many jobs to Massachusetts, it already is, as well as 800 megawatts of very affordable power at a wholesale rate of 7 cents. And that is one of the cheapest that we have seen. We also have the 800 megawatt Mayflower Wind project that is in the permitting process, and the roadmap, the climate roadmap bill that was passed earlier this year upped the required amount of megawatts to be procured by 2,400. So that means that there will be up to 4,000 megawatts that are currently statutorily enabled to be procured by the distribution companies in Massachusetts. So that is a total of 5,600 megawatts of wind. That's a huge amount, and it will do an incredible job to power Massachusetts by mostly renewable energy by 2030. That said, we still need more, and we need even more because some of you may have heard that the big hydro power project that Massachusetts was expecting several years ago, the Baker administration started a contract to procure about 20% of Massachusetts electricity from hydro in Canada. And that project is looking to be in jeopardy because of the issue of transmitting that power through Maine from Canada to Massachusetts. The people of Maine have voted to oppose that project. So we're really not sure if that's going to happen, although there are some court cases happening to try to get that project built. If we indeed do not have 20% of our electric mix coming from hydropower from Canada, then we're going to need even more offshore wind. So we are supporting a project that will, or we're supporting legislation that would further expand offshore wind and also require strong labor standards, strong environmental standards in offshore wind in Massachusetts going forward. There's a lot of energy from about offshore wind from our political leaders in Massachusetts, especially Chair Roy of the Telecommunications Committee and Speaker Mariano of the Massachusetts House. They have talked about trying to pass another offshore wind-focused piece of legislation as soon as possible. Most recently, in informal session in Massachusetts, the ARPA bill, which is about federal spending, set aside a lot of money, over $100 million, I believe, for various offshore wind infrastructure. As we get more renewable energy in Massachusetts, we are going to need to make sure our electric grid can handle it. That's why we are intervening in 2 cases at the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts that are focused on grid modernization and smart meters. This is 21-80, 21-81. 21-80 is the Eversource case. 21-81 is about National Grid. In both of these cases, the utility companies have filed plans to invest in certain grid modernization infrastructure It will make the grid better able to take in renewable energy and distribute it around Massachusetts. It's especially focused on things like solar, which are distributed energy, small-scale solar scattered around the state. They have also proposed to install smart meters in residential consumer homes. That is really exciting to us because that will enable better efficiency programs like Shave the Peak, which many of you may be part of, and time of use rates, which would compensate energy consumers for using electricity at the time that is best for the environment and best for the electric grid. And I'll pass over to Mao to talk about transportation.
Thanks, Kai. So as Larry had mentioned in the larger room, we at Green Energy Consumers are extremely disappointed in Governor Baker's decision to pull Massachusetts out of the Transportation and Climate Initiative Program, or TCI for short. The program would have generated $160 million annually for Massachusetts over 10 years to be able to invest in clean transportation options. So that would mean electric vehicle charging infrastructure. It could mean more investments in transit, more investments in active mobility, all things that would reduce emissions while making our mobility and transportation infrastructure more resilient and better serving of Massachusetts residents. And so, yeah, we are definitely looking to Governor Baker to propose a plan B because the TCI program was a central strategy for the Clean Energy and Climate Plan that Kai was talking about earlier. So without TCI on the table, we're curious to see exactly how the state is planning on investing in a decarbonized transportation system. As a consumer organization, Green Energy Consumers is also aware of the irony of the governors of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island pulling out of TCI because of high gas prices. Gasoline is extremely volatile as a consumer product in terms of price. It's one of the reasons why electric vehicles are extremely appealing to folks that want to ratchet down their fuel costs and their driving costs, because electricity doesn't vary as much in terms of cost. And so TCI would have been able to help more people switch away from gasoline to transportation options that are more consistent in price and also lower in emissions. So we're definitely looking to support other policies and other ideas to help Massachusetts transition to cleaner forms of transportation. But we're very aware that there is not a specific policy that fills in the gap that TCI is, or the lack of TCI is creating. And so we're really looking forward to doing some more advocacy work around that in 2022. I will say that regardless of what you might see in the media, the TCI program is not dead. It's more like on life support. So the program can move forward anytime 3 states decide to sign on and continue. So we definitely are optimistic for 2023 for the TCI program. But it's not all bad news. We are very impressed with the utility investments proposed by National Grid and Eversource to expand electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Alongside of the investments that National Grid and Eversource are proposing for grid modernization, they also have a couple of dockets to expand the EV charging infrastructure in Massachusetts. So for several years now, both utilities have had programs to help businesses and fleets and apartment buildings install charging by covering the cost of the utility side infrastructure for those charging stations. But now they're proposing a huge expansion of those programs alongside lots of really important investments to help pay for the actual charging equipment. They're planning on investing in some new ideas like creating DC fast charging hubs so that people who don't have access to charging at home can potentially switch to an EV anyway because of community charging, and also some great and exciting ideas about providing school districts with rebates to be able to buy electric school buses. They are interested in pursuing on-street charging pilot programs to see whether you can put charging stations on utility poles, which they already own. And so we're seeing a huge increase in investment from both utilities. You can see the breakdown of how each utility plans on focusing on the different segments. And for comparison, the phase 1 of these programs were sized at about $40 million for Eversource and $25 million for National Grid. So you can see it's a much larger investment and a commitment. So right now, Green Energy Consumers is working on trying to support these ideas. The dockets will be under scrutiny at the DPU through June 2022, and we're actively involved in making sure that these programs move forward in a way that allows Massachusetts to expand its charging infrastructure so that we can meet our electric vehicle adoption goals and also support efforts to make sure that consumers get a good deal out of it. So I'll pass it on to Kai.
Thank you, Mel. And to touch on the final sector of emissions that we really need strong program and policy to address, buildings. Buildings is especially challenging because the solutions are not as well developed as in the electric sector and transportation sector. I will say the challenge before us in all of these areas is immense, but with buildings, electrification is, I think there's a lot more open-endedness around what the right policy to support the decarbonization of buildings are. We're going to need a lot of different policies. All of these different pieces of policy are part of the solution. And today I'll touch on energy efficiency in particular. This past year, many stakeholders have been involved in developing, advocating for strong emissions reductions policy in the 2022 through 2024 Mass Save Energy Efficiency Plan. I imagine most of you are familiar with Mass Save. This is the utility-run energy efficiency programs that are also statutorily required in Massachusetts. They provide free energy audits to anyone in Massachusetts. They also are responsible for providing incentives for energy efficient equipment and the home energy reports that will let you have an idea of how much energy you're using every month and so much more. These energy efficiency programs are responsible for a lot of the emissions reductions we have seen over the past decade in electric sector and building sector. And yet they are just not, historically, they are not doing enough to get us on a path to reducing emissions in line with state climate goals in the building sector or the electric sector. However, this energy efficiency plan, which stakeholders have been working on for over a year now, is a really big step forward on energy efficiency. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. The Massachusetts Climate Roadmap Bill that passed this past March, one of the many things that it did was require the Office of EEA in Massachusetts, the Energy Environmental Agency, to set a greenhouse gas emissions reductions goal required for the Mass Save Energy Efficiency Plan. And this chart here demonstrates what exactly is so exciting about that requirement. The April draft, you'll see, so on the left, we have the Secretary's goal of 2030 of metric tons of carbon emissions reduced by 2030. The April draft is the first draft that the program administrators, the utility companies, came out with of the 2022 through 2024 energy efficiency plan. What they had proposed initially was really nowhere near the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we needed to see. But because this was required for the program administrators to achieve, you can see there's later drafts on October 6th, and the final plan actually do get us to that goal. And this resulted in a plan that is by far the biggest we've ever seen in Massachusetts, both in the amount of investments going into energy efficiency and the amount of benefits that we're going to receive. The beautiful thing about these energy efficiency plans is that every dollar that ratepayers invest in them comes back and benefits to Massachusetts residents. This plan over 3 years has a $4 billion budget on gas and electric and $14 billion in benefits, which include lowered bills for consumers in Massachusetts, utility system benefits that reduce the amount of investment that we need in things like substations, new gas pipelines, and also health, climate, economic, and other benefits. So this plan is going to be really incredible for Massachusetts. It is currently before the Department of Public Utilities for final approval. Last week, many folks weighed in at the public hearings at the DPU in support of this plan. Also of note is that in the past, we have not seen the utility companies serving environmental justice communities or low-income folks as well as they need to be in Massachusetts. A lot of people, especially who don't speak English, who are renters, don't have access to energy efficiency the same way that people who have more money or have single-family homes do. This plan has a number of equity and EJ commitments that go above and beyond past plans. For example, a target investment in environmental justice communities. There is a requirement that the program administrators will create a strategic plan to target renters and serve renters better. There's also increased electrification goals of over 67,000 residential heat pumps. And for the first time, the program administrators have committed to electrifying a small number of gas heat systems, which is notable because the utility companies are also gas companies. So electrifying their gas heating systems goes against what you would expect program administrators to do. However, all of this is just not enough. 67,000 residential heat pumps is nowhere close to what the draft CECP promised in terms of 1 million residential homes electrified by 2030. And we need other forms of policy to get us to our goals on the building sector. Since the passage of the roadmap bill and also since the draft CECP came out last December, the administration has really fallen behind on the building sector in particular. They promised to set up a clean heat commission to come up with strategies on the building sector by last May. It is now December, and that clean heat commission is still not up and running, despite an executive order that came out earlier this fall related to the clean heat commission and announcing it. In addition, they have kicked the can down the road with regard to a new building code, a net zero building code, another requirement of roadmap. And those public hearings were supposed to be this fall. They're now not going to happen until this spring. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan proposed a heating fuels emissions cap. We don't really know where that's at, and we'll generally need to see a lot more movement on this. So we will be supporting some legislation to reduce emissions from buildings, and we'll talk about that probably in future webinars or blogs. And we want to make sure that we have time for at least a couple questions, so we'll move on to that. But first, please remember to give if you can. Your contributions are really important to us being able to do this work. So thanks so much, and we will now go over to questions.
Thanks, Kai. I'll start off by reading out a question from Alan, which is, has the More EV program been renewed by the legislature? It was due to expire at the end of December. This is a relatively easy one that I'm happy to take on because it's transportation related. The answer is the program has been renewed. The funding that was allocated through December 2021 should be able to move forward through the summer of 2022. I think it's either June and July, or June or July. And I think the announcement just happened yesterday. So it's hot off the press, is brand new. Great question. I'll move on to this next question for Kai from John, which says, Will the new mass save rebate programs include rebates for residential transition from natural gas to electric heat pumps? If so, how big are the new rebates and when will they take effect?
Yes, so I guess I'll start by answering the question saying that the plan is still before the DPU and awaiting final approval of the DPU. The DPU could conceivably make changes, but the draft plan stakeholder support does, for the first time ever, support incentives for converting natural gas homes to electric. I don't know off the top of my head how big they will be, but if the plan is approved, then we would expect that to start in January. And I'm not sure if there will be any additional requirements for your home, but for example, you will also need to have a well-weatherized home, but that's a great thing to have no matter what.
Great. We have a question from Allison about the confusion that lots of community and municipal groups are having related to decarbonizing buildings and local building codes. So the question is, how can communities make good, informed, and inclusive decisions about how to move forward with that process?
I will start by saying that I totally share in the confusion and angst around decarbonizing buildings more broadly. It's one of the most difficult things that we have ahead of us. I think that net zero building codes focus primarily on new buildings, which is relatively easy because new buildings can be made net zero at same cost or less cost than a new fossil fuel building. So that's kind of where net zero buildings are focused. Net zero local building codes are focused. And to the question of how can communities make good, informed, and inclusive decisions, I will point to NEEP, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, as a great resource on local building codes. MCAN has also been doing a lot of work on local building codes. MAPC is another organization that is great on this, and they focus on getting those resources to local communities. Green Energy Consumers supports the EZ code that NEEP is proposing for a statewide net zero code. And so this spring, there will be public hearings run by DOER on proposed building code. We really want to see more action engagement from municipalities saying that they will adopt this code if it is available. Because for that code to be proposed statewide, it's great to have buy-in from local communities. So I think, although I think there's lots of resources out there to describe what this code is and what it means for communities, and we do want to see more from communities supporting that. Recently, there was a sign-on letter from a bunch of different communities supporting net zero building codes. So if your community has not been part of that, then that is an option for us to, as advocates, advocate for our communities to sign on to that letter. And we can send that around with our follow-up information so that you have that information and can ask your council or mayor to sign on.
Awesome. Carol Collins also seems to be interested in some resources about the details of the 3-year efficiency plans. Can you point to any good places to learn about that?
Yes, I think there are some great resources on the EEAC website. However, if any of you have been on the EEAC website, then you know that it is like a huge onslaught of information, and there are dozens of 300-page documents, reports, plans. So there are also lots of good roundups, I believe, online from different organizations. We haven't posted a roundup yet, but I plan to do that within the next week. So stay tuned to follow our blog for some highlights of the efficiency plans. And again, we can also send that out in our follow-up email. I have a couple of shorter roundups of the highlights of the efficiency plan that we can make sure to include.
I definitely know that both of us are very busy in terms of trying to read through state documents and translate it so that regular folks interested in these issues can follow. That's been a big issue with the DPU dockets as well. So just want to re-up Kai's plug for our blog, which typically is the best resource to be able to learn what's going on in Massachusetts quickly and without having to go through all of those documents. Robert had a question about what the legislature's role will be in moving ahead with the roadmap. So can you talk a little bit about what that process will be like?
Yes, so it's an interesting legislative session. To give an overview, the Massachusetts has 2-year legislative sessions. Our current legislative session began this past January and will go until July. There has been many climate-related bills that have been filed. We support many of them. But the legislature, I think there is a sense that it already kind of passed its big climate bill, even back in March, even though that really was an extension of the last legislative session when the House and Senate passed their own separate bills, but weren't able to come to agreement before session ended. So I do think that there is a role for the legislature before this legislative session ends in July to pass bills that enable better implementation of roadmap. I think some that we would highlight are bills related to phasing out electric vehicles, as well as bills that enable some of these building sector reductions. We support in particular H3350 by Rep. Moschino, which would incentivize communities. It does many different things, including adopting building performance standards statewide to try to reduce emissions from existing buildings. It also incentivizes communities to opt up to that net zero building code and makes some small legislative changes to enhance the ability of Mass Save to reduce emissions as well. So I think that if we do see legislation move on climate, which of course we hope to, it's going to be some of these smaller fixes. Like we've had a roadmap for 8 months now. We can really dig in and plug the gaps of where roadmap didn't do enough to enable programs and policies that address the climate crisis. In addition, I think we'll likely see a wind bill, although as one of my colleagues who works on wind said, the wind bill is really more of an economic development bill than a climate bill. So it won't necessarily really ramp up the amount of emissions reductions we can hope to see from the electric sector. And I think our breakout rooms are closing in 45 seconds. I'm not sure if we have time for one more question. So I will start to wrap up by saying thank you for joining, and check out our blog, blog.greenenergyconsumers.org/blog. And if you do have time today, please donate to our advocacy program, because that enables us to expand the work that we're doing to fight the climate crisis in Massachusetts. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the presentation.